Chapter 6 of Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. Chapter 6. Private Holloway, Professor of Hygiene. The following morning we wandered through the trenches, listening to learned discourse of the genial professors of the peripatetic school, storing up much useful information for future reference. I made a serious blunder when I asked one of them a question about Ypres, for I pronounced the name French fashion, which put me under suspicion as a swanker. "Don't try to come it, son," he says. "Say wipers. That's what we calls it." Henceforth it was wipers for me, although I learned that the yips were sanctioned by some trench authorities. I made no further mistakes of this nature, and by keeping silent about the names of the towns and villages along our front, I soon learned the accepted pronunciation of all of them. Emitters is called Armentières, Balliol, Balliol, Hazybrook, and what more natural than Plug Street, Atkinese for Plugustra. As was the case wherever I went, my accent betrayed my American birth, and again, as an American Expeditionary Force of one, I was shown many favors. Private Shorty Holloway, upon learning that I was a Yank, offered to tell me every bloomin' thing about the trenches that a bloke needs to know. I was only too glad to place myself under his instruction. "Right you are," said Shorty. "Now sit down here while I'm goin' over me shirt, and arsk me anything you're mind to." I began immediately by asking him what he meant by going over his shirt. "Blimey, you are new to the game, mate. You mean say you ain't got any graybacks?" I confessed shamefully that I had not. He stripped to the waist, turned his shirt wrong side out, and laid it upon his knee. "'Ave a look," he said proudly. The less said about my discoveries, the better for the fastidiously minded. Suffice it to say that I made my first acquaintance with members of a British Expeditionary Force which is not mentioned in official communiques. "Trench pets," said Shorty. Then he told me that they were not all graybacks. There is a great variety of species, but they all belong to the same parasitical family, and wage a non-discriminating warfare upon the soldiery on both sides of no man's land. Germans, British, French, Belgians alike were all their victims. "You'll soon have plenty," he said reassuringly. "I give you about a week to go get covered with them. Now what you want to do is this. Always 'ave an extra shirt in your pack. Don't be a bloomin' ass and sell it for a package of fags like I did. And the next time you writes to England, you get someone to send you out some Keatings." He displayed a box of grayish-colored powder. "It won't kill 'em, mind you. They ain't nothin' but fire that'll kill 'em. But Keatings takes all the ginger out of 'em. They ain't near so lively after you strafe 'em with this here powder." I remembered Shorty's advice later when I became a reluctant host to a prolific colony of graybacks. For nearly 6 months I was never without a box of Keatings, and I was never without the need for it. Barbed wire had a new and terrible significance for me from the first day which we spent in the trenches. I could more readily understand why there had been so long a deadlock on the Western Front. The entanglements in front of the first line of trenches were from 15 to 20 yards wide, the wires being twisted from post to post in such a hopeless jumble that no man could possibly get through them under fire. The posts were set firmly in the ground, but there were movable segments every 50 or 60 yards, which could be put to one side in case an attack was to be launched against the German lines. At certain positions there were what appeared to be openings through the wire, but these were nothing less than man-traps, which have been found serviceable in case of an enemy attack. In an assault, men follow the line of least resistance when they reach the barbed wire. These apparent openings are V-shaped, with the open end toward the enemy. The attacking troops think they see a clear passageway. They rush into the trap, and then it is filled with struggling men. Machine guns are turned upon them, and, as Shorty said, "You got 'em cold." That, at least, was the presumption. Practically, man-traps were not always a success. The intensive bombardments which precede infantry attacks play havoc with entanglements, but there is always a chance of the destruction being incomplete, as upon one occasion further north, where Shorty told me a man-trap caught a whole platoon of Germans, dead to rights. "But this is what gives you the pip," he said. "'Ere we got 3 lines of trenches, all of 'em wired up so a rat couldn't get through without scratchin' hisself to death. Fritzy's got better wire than what we have, and more of it, and he's got more machine guns, more artillery, more shells. There ain't any old man-killer ever invented what they haven't got more of than we have. And at 'ome they're sayin', why don't they get on with it? Why don't they smash through? Let's have them come over 'ere and have a try. That's all I got to say." I didn't tell Shorty that I had been, not exactly an armchair critic, but at least a barrack-room critic in England. I had wondered why British and French troops had failed to smash through. A few weeks in the trenches gave me a new viewpoint. I could only wonder at the magnificent fighting qualities of soldiers who had held their own so effectively against armies equipped and armed and munitioned as the Germans were. After he had finished drugging his trench pets, Shorty and I made a tour of the trenches. I was much surprised at seeing how clean and comfortable they can be kept in pleasant summer weather. Men were busily at work sweeping up the walks, collecting the rubbish, which was put into sandbags hung on pegs at intervals along the fire trench. At night the refuse was taken back out of the trenches and buried. Most of this work devolved upon the pioneers whose business it was to keep the trenches sanitary. The fire trench was built in much the same way as those which we had made during our training in England. In pattern it was something like a tasseled border. For the space of 5 yards it ran straight. Then it turned at right angles around a traverse of solid earth 6 feet square. Then straight again for another 5 yards. Then around another traverse, and so throughout the length of the line. Each 5-yard segment, which is called a bay, offered firing room for 5 men. The traverses, of course, were for the purpose of preventing enfilade fire. They also limited the execution which might be done by one shell. Even so, they were not an unmixed blessing, for they were always in the way when you wanted to get anywhere in a hurry. And you are in a hurry when you sees a mini warfare comin' your way. But you gets trench legs after a while. It'll be a funny sight to see blokes walkin' along the street in London when the war's over. They'll be so used to dodging in and out of traverses, they won't be able to go in a straight line. As we walked through the firing line trenches, I could quite understand the possibility of one's acquiring trench legs. 5 paces forward, 2 to the right, 2 to the left, 2 to the left again, then 5 to the right, and so on, to Switzerland. Shorty was of the opinion that one could enter the trenches on the Channel coast and walk through to the Alps without once coming out on top of the ground. I am not in a position either to affirm or to question this statement. My own experience was confirmed to the part of the British front which lies between Messines in Belgium and Loos in France. There, certainly, one could walk for miles through an intricate maze of continuous underground passages. But the firing line trench was neither a traffic route nor a promenade. The great bulk of inter-trench business passed through the traveling trench, about 15 yards in rear of the fire trench and running parallel to it. The two were connected by many passageways, the chief difference between them being that the fire trench was the business district, while the traveling trench was primarily residential. Along the latter were built most of the dugouts, lavatories, and trench kitchens. The sleeping quarters for the men were not very elaborate. Recesses were made in the wall of the trench about 2 feet above the floor. They were not more than 3 feet high, so that one had to crawl in head first when going to bed. They were partitioned in the middle, and were supposed to offer accommodation for 4 men, 2 on each side. But, as Shorty said, everything depended on the ration allowance. 2 men who had eaten to repletion could not hope to occupy the same apartment. One had a choice of going to bed hungry or of eating heartily and sleeping outside on the firing bench. "There's a funny thing," he said. "Why do you suppose they make the dugouts open at one end?" I had no explanation to offer. "Crawl inside and I'll show you." I stood my rifle against the side of the trench and crept in. "Now you're supposed to be asleep," said Shorty, and with that he gave me a whack on the soles of my boots with his entrenching tool handle. I can still feel the pain of the blow. "Stand to! Wake up here! Stand to!" he shouted, and gave me another resounding wallop. I backed out in all haste. "Get the idea? That's how they wakes you up. At stand to, and when your turn comes for sentry. Not bad, what?" I said that it all depended on whether one was doing the waking or the sleeping, and that, for my part, when sleeping, I would lie with my head out. "You wouldn't if you belonged to our lot. They'd give it to you on the napper just as quick as on the feet. You ain't on to the game, that's all. Let me show you something." He crept inside and drew his knees up to his chest, so that his feet were well out of reach. At his suggestion, I tried to use the active service alarm clock on him, but there was not room enough in which to weld it. My feet were tingling from the effect of his blows, and I felt like the reputation for the resourcefulness of Kitchener's mob was at stake. In a moment of inspiration I seized my rifle, gave him a dig on the shins with the butt, and shouted, "Stand to, Shorty!" He came out, rubbing his leg ruefully. "You got the idea, mate," he said. "That's just what they does when you tries to double cross 'em by pullin' your feet in. I ain't sure where I likes it best, but on the shins or the feet." This explanation of the reason for building 3-sided dugouts, while not, of course, the true one, was none the less interesting, and certainly the task of arousing sleeping men for sentry duty was greatly facilitated with rows of protruding boot soles. "Simply arskin' to be it," as Shorty put it. All of the dugouts for privates and N.C.O.s were of equal size and built on the same model, the reason being that the walls and floors, which were made of wood, and the roofs, which were corrugated iron, were put together in sections at the headquarters of the Royal Engineers, who superintended all the work of trench construction. The material was brought up at night, ready to be fitted into excavations. Furthermore, with thousands of men to house within a very limited area, space was a most important consideration. There was no room for indulging individual tastes in dugout architecture. The roofs were covered with from 3 to 4 feet of earth, which made them proof against shrapnel or shell splinters. In case of a heavy bombardment with high explosive, the men took shelter in deep and narrow slip trenches. These were blind alleyways leading off from the traveling trench, with room for from 10 to 15 men in each. At this point of the line there were none of the very deep shell-proof shelters, from 15 to 20 feet below the surface of the ground, of which I had read. Most of the men seemed to be glad of this. They preferred taking their chances in that open trench during heavy shell fire. Realists and romanticists lived side by side in the traveling trench. "My little gray home in the West," was the modest legend over one apartment. The Ritz-Carlton was next door. The Rats' Retreat, with Vermin Villa next door. But one, the Suicide Club, was the suburban residence of some members of the bombing squad. I remarked that the bombers seemed to take a rather pessimistic view of their profession, whereupon Shorty told me that if there were any men slated for the Order of the Wooden Cross, the bombers were those unfortunate ones. In assault they were first at the enemy's position. He had dangerous work to do even on the quietest of days, but theirs was a post of honor, and no one of them but was proud of his membership in the Suicide Club. The officers' quarters were on a much more generous and elaborate scale than those of the men. This I gathered from Shorty's description of them, for I saw only the exteriors as we passed along the trench. Those for platoon and company commanders were built along the traveling trench. The colonel, major, and adjutant lived in a luxurious palace about 50 yards down a communication trench. Near it was the officers' mess, a café de luxe with glass panels in the door, a cooking stove, a long wooden table, chairs, everything, in fact, but hot and cold running water. "You know," said Shorty, "the officers think they has to rough it, but they got it soft. I'm tellin' you, wooden bunks to sleep in, batmen to bring 'em hot water for shavin' in the mornin', all the fags they wants. Blimey, I wondered what they called livin' high." I agreed that in so far as living quarters are concerned, they were roughing it under very pleasant circumstances. However, they were not always so fortunate, as later experience proved. Here there had been little serious fighting for months, and the trenches were at their best. Elsewhere the officers' dugouts were often but little better than those of the men. The first-line trenches were connected with two lines of support or reserve trenches, built in precisely the same fashion, and each heavily wired. The communication trenches which joined them were from 7 to 8 feet deep and wide enough to permit the convenient passage of incoming and outgoing troops, and the transport of wounded back to the field dressing stations. From the last reserve line they wound on backward through the fields until troops might leave them well out of range of rifle fire. Under Shorty's guidance I saw the field dressing stations, the dugouts for the reserve ammunition supply, and the stores of bombs and hand grenades, battalion and brigade trench headquarters. We wandered from one part of the line to another through trenches, all of which were kept amazingly neat and clean. The walls were stayed with fine mesh wire to hold the earth in place. The floors were covered with boardwalks carefully laid over the drains, which ran along the center of the trench and emptied into deep wells built in recesses in the walls. I felt very much encouraged when I saw the careful provisions for sanitation and drainage. On a fine June morning it seemed probable that living in ditches was not to be so unpleasant as I had imagined it. Shorty listened to my comments with a smile. "Don't pat yourself on the back yet awhile, mate," he said. "They looks right enough now, but wait until you've seen 'em under arter and a 'eavy rain." I had this opportunity many times during the summer and autumn. A more wretched existence than that of soldiering in wet weather can hardly be imagined. The walls of the trenches caved in great masses. The drains filled to overflowing, and the trench walks were covered deep in mud. After a few hours of rain, dry and comfortable trenches became a quagmire, and we were kept busy for days afterward repairing the damage. As a machine gunner, I was particularly interested in the construction of the machine gunning placements. The covered battle positions were very solidly built. The roofs were supported with immense logs or steel girders, covered over with many layers of sandbags. There were 2 carefully concealed loopholes looking out to a flank, but none for frontal fire, as this dangerous little weapon best enjoys catching troops in enfilade, owing to the rapidity and the narrow cone of its fire. Its own front is protected by the guns on the right and left. At each emplacement there was a range chart giving the ranges to all parts of the enemy's trenches, and to every prominent object both in front and behind them. Within this field of fire, when not in use, the gun was kept mounted and ready for action in the battle position. "But remember this," said Shorty. "You never fires from your battle position except in case of attack. When you goes out at night and 'ave a little go at Fritzie, you always takes your gun somewheres else. If you don't, you'll 'ave Minnie and Betsy Bertha and all the rest of the Krupp children comin' over to see where you live." This was a wise precaution, as we were soon to learn from experience. Machine guns are objects of special interest to the artillery, and the locality from which they are fired becomes very unhealthy for some little time thereafter. We stopped for a time at the Mud Works hairdressing parlor, a very important institution if one might judge by its patronage. It was housed in a recess in the wall of the traveling trench, and was open to the sky. There I saw the latest fashion in overseas haircuts. The victim sat on a ration box, while the barber mowed great swaths through tangled thatch with a pair of close-cutting clippers. But instead of making a complete job of it, a thick fringe of hair, which resembled a misplaced scalping tuft, was left for decorative purposes just above the forehead. The effect was so grotesque that I had to invent an excuse for laughing. It was a lame one, I fear, for Shorty looked at me warningly. When we had gone on a little way, he said, "Ain't it a proper beauty parlor? But you got to be careful about larfin'. Some of the blokes think that edge row is a regular ornament." I had supposed that a daily shave was out of the question on the firing line, but the British Tommy is nothing if not resourceful. Although water is scarce and fuel even more so, the self-respecting soldier easily surmounts difficulties, and the Gloucesters were all nice in matters pertaining to the toilet. Instead of draining their canteens of tea, they saved a few drops for shaving purposes. "It's a bit sticky," said Shorty, "but it's 'ot and not 'arf bad when you gets used to it. Now another thing you don't want to forget is this. When you're moving up for your week in the first line, always bring a bundle of firewood with you. There ain't so much as a matchstick left in the trenches. Then you wants to be savin' of it. Don't go and use it all the first day, or you'll 'ave to do without your tea the rest of the week." I remember his emphasis on the point afterward, when I saw men risking their lives in order to procure firewood. Without his tea, Tommy was a wretched being. I do not remember a day, no matter how serious the fighting, when he did not find both the time and the means for making it. Shorty was a Ph.D. in every subject in the curriculum, including domestic science. In preparing breakfast, he gave me a practical demonstration of the art of conserving a limited source of fuel, bringing our 2 canteens to a boil with a very meager handful of sticks, and while doing so he delivered an oral thesis on the best methods of food preparation. For example, there was an item of corned beef, familiarly called bully. It was a piece de resistance at every meal, with the possible exception of breakfast, when there was usually a strip of bacon. Now one's appetite for bully becomes jaded in the course of a few weeks or months. To use the German expression, one doesn't eat it gern. But it is not a question of liking it. One must eat it or go hungry. Therefore, said Shorty, save carefully all of your bacon grease, and, instead of eating your bully cold, out in the tin, mix it with breadcrumbs and grated cheese and fry it in the grease. He prepared some in this way, and I thought it a most delectable dish. Another way of stimulating the palate was to boil the beef in a solution of bacon grease and water, and then, while eating it, kid yourself it's Irish stew. This second method of taking away the curse did not appeal to me very strongly, and Shorty admitted that he practiced such self-deception with very indifferent success. For, after all, bully was bully, in whatever form you ate it. In addition to this staple, the daily rations consisted of bacon, bread, cheese, jam, army biscuits, tea, and sugar. Sometimes they received a tinned meat and vegetables ration, already cooked, and at welcome intervals fresh meat and potatoes were substituted for corned beef. Each man got a very generous allowance of food, a great deal more, I thought, than he could possibly eat. Shorty explained this by saying that allowance was made for the amount which would be consumed by the rats and the bluebottle flies. There were, in fact, millions of flies. They settled in great swarms along the walls of the trenches, which were filled to the brim with warm light as soon as the sun had climbed a little way up the sky. Empty tin-lined ammunition boxes were used as cupboards for food. But of what avail were cupboards to a jam-loving and jam-fed British Army living in open ditches in the summer-time? Fly-traps, made of empty jam tins, were set along the top of the parapet. As soon as one was filled, another was set in its place. But it was an unequal war against an expeditionary force of countless numbers. "They ain't nothin' you can do," said Shorty. "They steal the jam right off your bread." As for the rats, speaking in the light of later experience, I can say that our Army Corps of Pied Pipers would not have sufficed to entice away the hordes of them that infested the trenches, living like house pets on our rations. They were great lazy animals, almost as large as cats, and so gorged with food that they could hardly move. They ran over us in the dugouts at night, and flinched cheese and crackers right through the heavy waterproof covering of our haversacks. They squealed and fought among themselves at all hours. I think it possible that they were carrion eaters, but never, to my knowledge, did they attack living men. While they were unpleasant bedfellows, we became so accustomed to them that we were not greatly concerned about our very intimate associations. Our course of instruction at the Parapet School was brought to a close late in the evening when we shouldered our packs, bade good-bye to our friends the Gloucesters, and marched back in the moonlight to our billets. I had gained an entirely new conception of trench life, of the difficulties involved in trench building, and the immense amount of material and labor needed for the work. Americans who are interested in learning of these things at first hand will do well to make the grand tour of the trenches when the war is finished. Perhaps the 30 Continentals will seek to commercialize such advantage as misfortune has brought them, in providing favorable opportunities. Perhaps the Touring Club of France will lay out a new route, following the windings of the firing line from the Channel coast across the level fields of Flanders, over the Vosges Mountains to the borders of Switzerland. Pedestrians may wish to make the journey on foot, cooking their supper over Tommy's rusty biscuit tin stoves, sleeping at night in the dugouts, where he lay shivering with cold during the winter nights of 1914 and 1915. If there are enthusiasts who will be satisfied with only the most intimate personal view of the trenches, if there are those who would try to understand the hardships and discomforts of trench life by living it during a summer vacation, I would suggest that they remember Private Shorty Holloway's parting injunction to me. "Now, don't forget, Jamie," he said as we shook hands, "always have a box of Keating's handy, and hang on to your extra shirt." End of chapter 6.